All right, picking up where we left off, this is part 4, chapter 6, learning. How do the consequences of an action shape behavior? Operant conditioning involves active learning. Operant conditioning, or instrumental conditioning, is a learning process in which the consequences of an action determine the likelihood that it will be performed in the future. B.F. Skinner chose the term operant to express the idea that animals operate on their environments to produce effects. Law of effect. Edward Thorndike performed the first reported carefully controlled experiments in comparative animal psychology using a puzzle box. He used chickens at first, but later used cats. There was a lever that pulled a string and opened a door for escaping. It took a while to learn at first, but this quickened with subsequent trials. He then produced the law of effect. Law of effect is any behavior that leads to a satisfying state of affairs is likely to occur again, and any behavior that leads to an annoying state of affairs is less likely to occur again. Alright, here's a picture of Thorndike's puzzle box. Thorndike used puzzles, such as the one depicted here, to assess learning in animals. Reinforcement increases behavior. 30 years after Thorndike, Skinner developed a more formal learning theory based on the law of effect. He objected to the subjective aspects of Thorndike's law of effect. States of satisfaction are not observed empirically. They are subjective. Skinner believed that behavior occurs because it has been reinforced. A reinforcer is a stimulus that follows a response and increases the likelihood that the response will be repeated. Skinner created an operant chamber that allowed repeated conditioning trials without requiring interaction from the experimenter. It contained one lever connected to a food supply and another connected to a water supply. Here's a picture of B.F. Skinner, and he studied the animal's operations on its laboratory environment. Here's a close-up of that box that shows the levers for food and water. Sometimes animals take a long time to perform the precise desired action. What can be done to make them act more quickly? Shaping is an operant conditioning technique that consists of reinforcing behaviors that are increasingly similar to the desired behavior. Successive approximations start with any behavior that even slightly resembles the desired behavior. How do superstitions start? Culture influences specific superstitions. In North America and Europe, the number 13, and in China, Japan, and Korea, and Hawaii, the number 4 are bad luck. Many sports stars engage in superstitious behaviors. B.F. Skinner started the scientific study of superstitious behavior in 1948 using pigeons as subjects. The pigeons developed a number of superstitious behaviors that they normally would not perform. Because these pigeons were performing particular actions when the reinforcers were given, their actions were accidentally reinforced. This type of learning is called auto-shaping. The actions were strange motions, such as extending their heads and waving them. Just the random things they were doing when the food magically appeared. Associating events that occur together in time. Both animals and humans have a tendency to associate events that occur together in time. This tendency is extremely strong because the brain is compelled to understand things. Pigeons develop behaviors that look like superstitions, and people look for reasons to explain outcomes. The observed association serves that purpose. Critical thinking helps us to avoid creating superstitions. There are many types of reinforcement. There are primary and secondary. Primary reinforcers satisfy biological needs such as food or water. Secondary reinforcers are events or objects established through classical conditioning that serves as reinforcers but do not satisfy biological needs. For example, money, compliment, or likes on social media. Reinforcer potency. David Premack theorized about how a reinforcer's value could be determined. The key is the amount of time an organism, when free to do anything, engages in a specific behavior associated with the reinforcer. He developed the Premack principle. Using a more valued activity can reinforce the performance of a less valued activity. Eat your vegetables and you can have ice cream. However, the reinforcer's value is determined by the individual. If a person loves lima beans that much, offering them lima beans will serve as a reinforcer. Reinforcement can be both positive and negative, and either way can increase the likelihood of a behavior. In positive reinforcement, the administration of a stimulus to increase the probability of a behavior being repeated. In a negative reinforcement, there is a removal of a stimulus to increase the probability of the behavior being repeated. All right, here's an example. In a positive reinforcement, the response rate increases because responding causes the stimulus to be given. In that case, it was the rat pressing the lever to get the food. In negative reinforcement, the response rate increases because responding causes the stimulus to be removed. In this example, they can press a lever and turn off a shocking. Operant conditioning is influenced by schedules of reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement is a type of learning in which behavior is reinforced each time it occurs. Partial reinforcement is a type of learning in which behavior is reinforced intermittently. The effect of partial reinforcement on conditioning depends on the reinforcement schedule. Partial reinforcement can be administered according to either the number of behavioral responses or the passage of time. In a ratio schedule, reinforcement is based on the number of times the behavior occurs. In an interval schedule, reinforcement is provided after a specific unit of time. Ratio reinforcement generally leads to greater responding than does interval reinforcement. Partial reinforcement can also be given on a fixed schedule or a variable schedule. In a fixed schedule, reinforcement is provided after a specific number of occurrences or after a specific amount of time. A variable schedule is reinforcement is provided at different rates or at different times. Operant conditioning is influenced by scheduled reinforcement. Continued. A fixed interval schedule occurs when reinforcement is provided after a certain amount of time has passed. A variable interval schedule occurs when reinforcement is provided after the passage of time, but the time is not regular. In a fixed ratio schedule, this occurs when reinforcement is provided after a certain number of responses has been made. In a variable ratio schedule occurs when reinforcement is provided after an unpredictable number of responses. Continuous reinforcement is highly effective for teaching a behavior. If the reinforcement is stopped, however, the behavior will extinguish quickly. In the partial reinforcement extinction effect, the greater persistence of behavior under partial reinforcement than under continuous reinforcement. This explains why gambling is so addictive. All right, now moving on to the opposite, punishment. This is the opposite of reinforcement. They have the opposite effects on behavior. Reinforcement increases a behavior's probability. Punishment decreases its probability. And just like reinforcement, there can be positive and negative punishment. In positive punishment, the administration of a stimulus is the administration of a stimulus to decrease the probability of a behavior reoccurring. Think spanking. In negative punishment, there is a removal of a stimulus to decrease the probability of a behavior reoccurring. In this condition, think of taking away a child's toys. In one situation, you're adding something. That's the word positive. In another situation, you're taking something away. That's the negative. All right, back to the same style graphic, kind of lays this all out for you. Negative and positive reinforcement and negative positive punishment. Effectiveness of parental punishment. For punishment to be effective, it must be reasonable, unpleasant, and applied immediately so that the relationship between the unwanted behavior and the punishment is clear. Punishment often fails to offset the reinforcing aspects of the undesired behavior. Research indicates that physical punishment is often ineffective compared with grounding and timeouts. Many psychologists believe that positive reinforcement is the most effective way of increasing desired behaviors while encouraging positive parent-child bonding. Let's see, I mentioned spanking before as an example of positive punishment, adding something to the scenario. These maps here compare the United States and Europe in terms of the legality of spanking children. In the United States, the red represents where spanking is not prohibited. The blue represents where spanking is prohibited in schools only. Whereas in Europe, spanking is prohibited, and in some areas it's prohibited in schools only, and in other areas it's prohibited in both. And that concludes Part 4 of Chapter 6, Learning.